Welcome, students, to your first content lecture in Adolescent Psychology, Psych 312. This will be an introduction to terminology and some of the ideas communicated in the introduction to your textbook. Any discipline is going to have a number of words that have to be defined. We're going to have to learn those words and understand that terminology in order to understand the discipline. So that's what we're going to be doing today, is looking at some of the terminology. The first thing that you need to learn or understand is that adolescent psychology is just one part of a larger discipline called developmental psychology. Developmental psychology is the study of change in behavior over time. And there are going to be two basic causes for that change. But before we get to that, what is behavior? Behavior may be broadly defined as actions or thoughts or feelings. Behaviors may be overt, like actions, or covert, like thoughts and feelings. In general, behavioral change is going to come about because of two things. One is what we call learning. Now, in psychology, we also use the term conditioning, or you might use the term training to mean the same thing. But learning is a change in behavior that is environmentally caused. Someone has shaped the environment in such a way to cause an organism to change its behavior. Now, here we see a young woman who, for whatever reason, has been motivated to engage in push-ups. She's certainly training her body to do this, and there may be some reward that she gets from engaging in this behavior. But more importantly, we see the dog sitting on her back. Now, the dog would not naturally sit on a person's back, but this dog has been trained to get up on her back and sit there while she does the push-ups. So the dog, we had to manipulate the environment and reward the dog for sitting quietly on the back while his master goes, or mistress goes up and down. So this is a really interesting example of learning. What is the other change in behavior? Well, it's maturation. Maturation is a change in behavior due to biological causes. This would be the nature of the individual. It's genetic causes. It's something about the nature of the individual. So here we see a little baby, and this little baby is going to grow up to someday be a young man. And that pattern of development is going to be determined by that child's genetics. It's not something he learns. And there are a number of behaviors that we see that emerge that are biologically determined. Walking is a good example. Human beings learn to walk. You pretty much can't stop them from doing the walking thing. And it isn't that they're, quote, learning to walk, but rather they're maturing to walk because it's a biologically determined behavior. Adolescence. So this is the next thing that we have to define. What is adolescence? Adolescence can be broadly thought of as the second decade of life, but more importantly, it is also that developmental period between childhood and adulthood. And you'll notice that adolescence, the developmental period, ends in the letters CE. And this is critical, that the word that ends in CE refers to this developmental period. Why? Well, we're going to see in a minute. Because another term that we have is the adolescent, who is a person making the transition from childhood to adulthood. And here we see a couple of images of an individual who is in that process. The one on the left is about an 11-year-old, and the one on the right is an 8th grader. He's just about done and ready to head into high school. He's just on the cusp of moving into the high school age range, but he's still an adolescent. Here we see a bunch of these individuals making that transition from childhood to adulthood. Again, these are all, about 8th graders. And these individuals are called adolescents with a TS on the end. Unfortunately, in the English language, when you say adolescents with the CE on the end referring to the developmental period, it sounds exactly the same as adolescents, or people in that period of development. So that can be difficult. Hopefully we'll, especially if you're just listening to what I'm saying, but hopefully we'll be able to clarify that through closed captioning so that you'll be able to see which word I'm actually referring to. All right, More definitions. There is such a thing as early adolescence, that time period spanning roughly the ages of 11 to 14, or what are essentially the middle school years. Now, one of the things that you need to pay attention to is that your professor and the author of the textbook differ on this definition. The author of the textbooks includes 10-year-olds in here who are fifth graders. And sometimes fifth graders are in middle school, but more often not, they're not. Middle school is more typically 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. So I don't like to include the fifth graders, the 10-year-olds in the early adolescent grouping. And I also take it through to age 14 because that's pretty much that end of that middle school year. And I do this partly because I am, in fact, educating pre-service teachers. And so most of them are going to be utilizing these breaks that are very clear in the educational system. And so that's the other reason that I differ from the textbook author. What you need to remember is that I write the tests. So remember to use my definition that's presented here. Second, another definition of middle adolescent is the time period spanning the ages of 15 to 18, or the high school years. Again, that makes sense for pre-service teachers to be utilizing this categorization. And finally, we have late adolescence, that period of time spanning the ages of 19 to 22, or the college years. And this includes the group of people called the forgotten half. Well, they're forgotten because they didn't go to college. And everything we know about 19 to 20-year-olds, 19 to 22-year-olds, comes from our research on college students. And so what is going on with those individuals who aren't in college is less well understood because we just don't research them as much. Now, this is a group of largely undergraduates. There's a couple graduate students tucked in there, but there's also a couple of faculty people. I don't know if you can pick them out or not, but the really old one in the back in the blue shirt with the blonde hair, well, that's not an adolescent. That's your professor, and this is my group of lab students, so my labbies who work with me doing research. Another concept that's been introduced recently is that of the emerging adult. And this is a recent concept that has been introduced about the last 10 years by Jeffrey Arnett. And he includes 18 to 25-year-olds, so it's a little bit longer than what we would think of as late adolescence. This is a period of transition from adolescence to adulthood, which doesn't really apply to everyone because it's really about people trying to launch careers. And so it's very specific to Western society and to the more affluent of Western society. And so be aware that that doesn't apply to everyone. One thing I do want to highlight before I go on has to do with this late adolescence thing. A lot of times people in my courses confuse high school with late adolescence rather than with middle adolescence, because high school doesn't make you think of middle, but high school is middle and middle is early. So you have to remember that because it can get a little bit confusing. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about these things.